financial inclusion, again, is a necessity. Again, back to the point that I was taking, that we didn't have a lot of infrastructure as in Africa. So again, the M-Pesa was something. What happened in Nigeria was I would say, an amazing thing. It was something that picked up like exponentially. And while having this mobile wallet in other places of the world did not have the same pickup. Again, because you didn't have the infrastructure. So again, whenever there is a new technology is being introduced, then this, and Africa is in a very big need of have this kind of a financial, I would say, applications. Yeah. Speaking of the data and AI, again, this would be a very interesting part where we start monetizing the data, right? So again, what we have as data right now, we can build on that with a lot of applications, and we can start monetizing the data part on that side. We as our group also were investing a bit on the data and AI part. Again, we see that this is the future. So maybe in Africa it would take some time to have the databases that we can start doing an AI on top, or like, so, because in AI you need to have some structured data before starting your analytics part. But we think it's a very promising business.
So, yeah, financial inclusion is at the epicenter of what we promote at the bank, and AI is trying to play a role there. One of the big effort we are pushing, beside supporting our friends and clients who are evolving in that space, is on our own. The bank has established something called PAPS, which is a payment for settlement across the continent, where we allow effectively different central banks who happen to be our shareholders to permit the banks to settle it between themselves. Whatever you observe in terms of problems to get to another African country, where you kind of have to leave the continent to come back to the continent when you go next door, is what happens on every corner. It's not only when you travel, when you wire money, it leaves the continent and comes back to the next door country. Strange, but that's kind of how it's been. But we're now being forced, because a lot of foreign banks are leaving. So we need a solution that is homegrown. So it's at that level that we're trying to provide an infrastructure to help the payment players, the banks, the settlement. So we're really trying to enhance the experience. But in terms of financial inclusion, given the point we raised earlier about youth, you can only see how critical it is to find a solution to it, because we're going to be a continent where we can exploit that resource, or it'll be a mining field, as you heard. And essentially, most individuals evolve around being able to have a safe home. But once your safe home is solved, you need to eat, you need to trade, you need health, and then you need education. So I would argue that any AI around those 5 subjects will only prevail. And obviously, you cannot do anything around digital without solving the logistic. So at this moment when we speak, when you're talking about financial inclusion, we need to realize that even a company that when we were kids, a company called Apple, that used to just design a big box, it was a computer, has evolved to take over Walkman, to become an iPod, then evolve to take the phone space to give us iPhone. But recently has started becoming the primary POS. Your phone is going to become a POS. So all these merchants buying POS from different providers we've grown to know in financial inclusion, that industry is about to be taken over also by Apple. Now, a few days back, that same company has announced that it's going to start giving loans to its customer base. And that progression is all based on AI because they have data around those customers. So when you think about the other side of financial inclusion, where we're trying to get more people to adopt those services, you have a big tech company that already has a strategy to go from a computer company to a bank. So tomorrow, there's not going to be one bank that can compete with the balance sheet of Apple. So anything you can do on the other side of the fence, because Apple is really the private jet of humanity. But if you're doing something around economy class, business class, first class, even the private jet strategy is around that. So we cannot, as banks or non-banks, not do something on that side. So it is critical. AI, like you were saying, you cannot dissociate technology to AI. You cannot dissociate banking to AI. It's everything in a few years is linked to it. So you cannot ignore it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ibrahim. Mr. Hardy, as they say, before banking the unbanked, you need to connect the unconnected. And I think the Cassava group had been doing a lot of efforts in connecting the unconnected. How you will see this impacting your plans for going to bank the unbanked as well?
The first electric device was introduced in Africa 30 years after it had been introduced elsewhere in the world, in Cape Town. So it took 30 years for the first electric device to come on the African shore. It took 4 years, once a telephone had been discovered and designed, for a telephone to land in Cape Town, in South Africa. It took 26 years for the first computer to be installed in Johannesburg, after the first computer had been installed in the US and in Europe. It took 21 years for the first GSM mobile phone to ring on the African continent after GSM mobile phones had been launched in other parts of the world. It took 26 years for the internet to arrive on the African continent, after the internet was being used elsewhere in the world. But then we woke up. It took 2 years for Wi-Fi to land in Africa after it had been launched elsewhere in the world. And in 2007, everybody had to follow us on mobile money because we were number one. And I think that's, for us at Cassava Technologies, that's really is what drives us on the vision of a digitally connected future that leaves no African behind. I always make a joke, which is serious, it's not really a joke. Africans cannot afford a bank account. Okay, let me just repeat that. Africans cannot afford a bank account. It's too expensive. Why do I need a bank account? So every time that I speak to my banking colleagues, I say, if you're still trying to open a bank account for your customer, you are 20 years too late. You told them 20 years ago that they can't be banked. You can't come to them now and say, I want to bank you. They say, but I don't need a bank. What do you want me to open a bank account for? So the banker will say, well, so that you can pay your friend. Say, but I'm already paying him. Say, oh, no, so that you can save money. No, but I can save money on my phone. So whatever it is that the bank says they could offer. So really for me, I would rather talk about bringing into the economic value chain those that were previously excluded. That's the mantra that we use. It's about bringing onto the digital inclusion agenda those that were previously considered to be unviable for inclusion. So financial inclusion for me is really not about, I only use the word unbanked because that's what everybody understands. But it's really those that were economically excluded previously, because we interact as economic entities. If I can't pay you and if you can't pay me, essentially you have delegated me to a non-entity. So getting people to be able to interact as economic entities is really what our fintech business, Sasai, is all about. One of the biggest issues on digital inclusion is the cost of access to data. Africa has the largest gap between coverage. So 85% of Africans have got access to a network. And by the end of this year, it will be almost 90%. But only 39% of Africans routinely use that network that they've got access to. And that delta, which is the highest in the world, is explained by the cost of data. On average, it costs $6.70 for one to get a gigabyte of data on the African continent. In some places, it's as high as $13. You just need to go to Luanda, as my brother here does every now and again.
I'm going there next week.
Asia is $1.83. Europe is about, just under $2. Now, if you think about the intensity of $6.73 on our GDP per capita, it's too high. A household is literally having to think about, do we buy half a loaf of bread or do we buy a digital access? But digital has become a key part of the shopping basket. So that's why we have decided to launch an attack on the cost of data. And our desire is to bring down the cost of a gigabyte of data in Africa to under 20 cents. We have now been able to achieve that in Nairobi. And we're doing that in the areas where people live. Now, what do I mean by that? So most of you don't live where people live. So if in South Africa, we're not doing this in Sandton, we're doing this in Soweto, for example. In Nairobi, we're not doing this in Karen, we're doing this in Umoja, for those of you that come from Kenya. In Lagos, we would like to be able to do that in Ikeja. In Ghana, we want to do that. So it's because that's really where these people are being excluded. So working with Google, we've been able to deliver a gigabyte of data to communities in Nairobi at under 10 cents a gigabyte. Because the unit economics of digital inclusion, it costs exactly 1 US cent to bring a gigabyte of data from Marseille, our point of presence in Marseille, to Mombasa. 1 cent. It costs us 2 cents to take the same gigabyte of data from Mombasa to Nairobi.
Wow.
But from our data center in Nairobi to a household that's 10 kilometers away, all of a sudden, that middle mile costs almost $1. So driving down the cost of the middle mile and driving down the cost of the last mile is what's going to bring digital inclusion in Africa. And that's why we've got this brand called Via. That's the mission of Via. It is to drive down the cost of data, because if we don't, we can't do AI, we can't do edutech, we can't do health tech. Even financial inclusion, because the current financial inclusion on mobile money is really based on really dumb technology. It's USSD, it's text messaging technology. Whereas Africa has 400 million smartphones already. So really that's what we're doing at Cassava to bring financial and digital inclusion. Thank you.